The cold came first, before he could name anything else. One moment there had been a road and headlights, and the familiar low ache of a body that had absorbed too many decades of bad choices, and then nothing, not darkness, not impact, not pain, just cold so absolute it had texture, like stepping through a wall made entirely of winter. He was in snow to his thighs. Logan stood there for a long moment, cataloguing. The sky above him was the grey-white of tallow fat. The trees were enormous and unfamiliar, their branches black and ice-slicked, arranged in no formation he recognized. The air smelled of pine resin and deep cold. And beneath both of those, blood, not one man's blood, but the blood of several. And something else underneath it, something he had no name for yet. Something that smelled like the memory of rotting things amplified into a presence, like winter itself had decided to become violent and specific. He extended his claws. The 6 blades came out between his knuckles, with the familiar sound of metal sliding through meat, and he let himself breathe through his nose while they caught the grey light. Whatever he had just walked into, he was not unarmed. He was never unarmed. Stryker had made certain of that somewhere across a century of bad history that had not left a mark on his face, but had left marks on everything else, and the fact still sat in his chest like a coal. The claws were his, grown from bone and mutation, but the metal coating them. He pushed that aside later. The blood smell was ahead of him, 40 yards into the trees. He moved toward it, because that was what he did when the world went sideways. Moved toward the problem rather than away from it, not from courage exactly, but from the long-settled knowledge that the problem would find him regardless, and he might as well have the angle. What he found at the edge of a clearing was the aftermath of a fight. 3 men. 2 of them on the ground, and on the ground so completely they were never getting up. Not from injury alone, he could see immediately, but from something that had unmade them below the level of injury. They were dressed in black, both of them, black cloaks and black gear that had gone ragged at the edges, and one had his sword still in his hand, which told Logan the fight had been short. The 3rd man was gone, south. Logan could smell his terror like a thrown stone still moving through the air. Genuine animal fear, the kind that strips all choice from a body and replaces it with the single imperative of distance. What was coming out of the trees to the north was not grieving anyone. They came in silence, which was the first wrong thing. Men in a fight made noise, pain and effort, and the specific human sounds of bodies working hard to stay alive. These things breathed no warnings. Their feet broke the crust of the snow exactly as a man's feet would, leaving the same compressed prints, but they moved as though walking were something they were doing by memory rather than intention. Arms at angles that required a shoulder to be dislocated, heads at tilts that required a neck to be broken. And the smell of them was rot and deep cold, and something below both. Something the part of Logan that was older than language recognized as categorically, irrevocably wrong. Dead things did not move. He had lived long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. He had not been genuinely surprised, he thought, in 30 years. He was standing at the edge of that clearing, surprised. Then the nearest one turned its head and found him, and the surprise was over, and he was fighting. He was very good at fighting. He had been for a very long time. The first one came at him, and he opened it from shoulder to hip in a single movement, which stopped it for approximately 2 seconds before it began to rise. He put his boot on its throat and pinned it, and looked at the rest of them, emerging from the tree line, and recalibrated fast. Different rules. Not the same fight as usual. He pulled the pinned one apart. It was stronger than it should have been, but not stronger than him. and the pieces kept moving separately, the hands still reaching, the legs still attempting purchase on the frozen ground. And he filed that at the back of his mind, behind the more immediate problem of the 8 still upright and approaching with the same terrible, purposeful silence. He fought. He took blows he would have needed surgery for in any other body, a blade across his ribs that scraped bone, something's fingers closing on his left arm with a force that should have shattered the joint and the wound sealed behind them fast, which was familiar. The familiar absence of lasting pain was the one constant he had carried across a century and a half of bad situations. He was grateful for it, in the bleak and automatic way of a man, grateful for a tool rather than a gift. But they kept coming, and the pieces kept moving, and after a minute of it, he understood that tearing them apart was not going to be enough. They had no interest in the damage he was doing. They simply continued, in pieces or whole, advancing with the patience of things that had no concept of retreat. "Fire," said the oldest part of his brain. He looked. Snow and frozen ground and the dead men's black gear. But there was ice-crusted rock jutting from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, and his claws were adamantium bonded over bone, and he had started fires this way before, in worse places than this. He drove his right hand against the rock face and raked hard, and the sparks caught the dry underside of a dead pine branch hanging just above the stone, and the branch took, and he grabbed it and swung it through the nearest white in a wide arc. The thing came apart in the fire and did not reassemble. He burned through the rest of them. It took several minutes. It was not graceful. By the end, he was coated in things he did not want to examine closely, and the wound at his ribs was closing slowly, slower than usual, which told him these creatures were not entirely ordinary, that something in them resisted the healing in a way that steel alone did not. But they were gone. The ones he hadn't burned already, retreating back into the tree line from the fire's reach, and the clearing was quiet. He watched his forearm knit itself closed in the orange light of the dying branch. Already the pain was receding. He had always found that part stranger than the rest of it, not the healing itself, but the speed of forgetting, the way his body refused to keep records. He stood in the aftermath of things and could not find the evidence on his skin an hour later. He carried his history in his mind, not his flesh. There were days when he thought that was worse. He heard the man before he found him. Heard the specific sound of controlled breathing, failing to be controlled. The tiny clicks of chattering teeth, a heartbeat that had been running hard, and hadn't begun to come down. 40 yards back and up, Logan looked up and found him in the branches of a great pine, 8 feet off the ground, arms locked around the trunk, eyes fixed on the dark edge of the tree line to the north, with the expression of someone who had left thinking behind entirely and was operating on what remained after thinking left. He was young, or young-ish. Hard to say in this light. He was wearing the same black gear as the dead men, the Night's Watch. He would learn later that the name meant nothing yet, and his face had the quality of a man who had just watched everything he knew about the world stop being true simultaneously. "You can come down," Logan said. The man stared at him from the branches. "They're gone." Logan glanced at the retreating darkness for now. The man climbed down badly and nearly fell the last 2 feet, and Logan didn't catch him, but stood close enough that if he had fallen, he wouldn't have hit the ground alone. The man got his feet under him and stood there shaking, looking at the clearing, at what was left in the clearing, and then looking at Logan with an expression that was trying to assemble itself into something less raw, and not quite managing it. Logan pointed north. "What are those things?" The man opened his mouth. What came out was not immediately, organized language. He caught the rhythm of it before the words, familiar shapes, familiar cadences, as though the same river had run through two very different landscapes and come out carrying the same water in different sounds. Close enough, or close enough for now. "The others," the man said finally. He said it the way people said the name of whatever they most feared, with the specific weight of a word that had been spoken in that same tone for a very long time, by men who had hoped it would never be necessary again. Logan looked north. The tree line held its silence. Whatever had retreated into it was still out there, and it was not alone, and it was not waiting in the way that things wait when they intend to stop waiting. He had a sense of scale that he did not yet have language for. Not dozens, but more. Not tonight, but soon. South, Logan said. The man nodded, already pointing, already leaning that direction with his whole body, as though the word itself was permission. Logan looked south. There was nothing there that he recognized. No landmark, no road, no reliable light, but south was where the living were, apparently, and the living were where information was, and information was what he needed before he could decide what to do about the thing he had just walked into. He retracted his claws. He started walking. He walked for 2 days. The cold did not improve. The landscape did not become more familiar. The trees thinned eventually and gave way to open country that should have felt like relief, but didn't, because the sky above it was the same curdled gray-white in every direction, and gave him nothing to navigate by except the downward slope of the land, which he followed on the reasonable assumption that water ran south and men built their settlements near water. He was right. He usually was about landscapes. He did not sleep. He did not particularly need to. The healing factor that had been knitting his body back together since he was a boy in Alberta kept his blood moving and his muscles fed in ways that made the ordinary demands of a human body negotiable rather than mandatory. He stopped once at a stream that was half frozen and drank. That was sufficient. On the morning of the second day he saw the wall. He stopped walking. He had stood beneath things that were supposed to be impressive before: mountains, cathedrals, the particular category of man-made object that exists primarily to communicate scale and make the observer feel small. He had been unmoved by most of them. He was not unmoved by this. It was not that it was tall, though it was taller than anything he had any right to expect in a landscape that had not yet shown him a building higher than 2 stories. It was not even the ice, the way it caught what little light the sky offered and refracted it into something cold and alive, like the wall itself was breathing. It was the fact that something had built this, and what they had been trying to keep out had apparently kept coming anyway, because last night he had seen what it looked like when it arrived, and it looked like the things that had been moving through that northern clearing without breathing. The wall was not a monument. It was a confession. It said, "We know what is out there, and we cannot stop it, so we have put this between ourselves and it, and hoped." He started walking again toward the gate. The fortress at the base was called Castle Black. He would learn, built into the southern face of the wall itself, its towers running up the stone and ice for the first 100 feet of the structure's height. The gate was open, which surprised him, and the men who moved through it looked at him the way men looked at strangers they had not been told to expect, with the specific attention of people whose job was to decide quickly whether a new thing was a threat. Several of them had that quality. None of them stopped him from walking in. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch was a man who had clearly been deciding things quickly for a long time. He was large and grey, and had the bearing of someone who had been competent in a demanding position for so many years that competence had become indistinguishable from his personality. He received Logan in the main hall with the survivor of the prologue's ranging party standing to one side, and he listened to Logan's account of the clearing. The dead, the fire, what had worked and what hadn't, with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on Logan's face, not on the places where the wounds should have been. That was what he noted eventually, the absence of wounds. "Renly described you as taking 3 blades, the Lord Commander said without inflection. He said one opened your side to the bone. It did, Logan said. You show no injury. I know. The Lord Commander studied him for a moment. He was not a man who let uncertainty become visible, but Logan's senses, the animal keen range that was the other thing his mutation had given him, beneath the claws and above the healing, registered the small tells. The shift in his breathing, the tightening at the corner of his eye. Not fear. Something more professional than fear. A man who had just been handed a variable he didn't have a category for and was methodically building one. You can take the black, the Lord Commander said finally. Or you can leave for the south. I'll leave for the south, Logan said. And return, probably. The Lord Commander nodded once, with the equanimity of a man who had learned not to argue with things he couldn't change. He gave Logan bread and black ale and a corner to sit in, and the men of Castle Black watched him with the particular quality of attention that people gave to things that had survived something they were not sure they could survive themselves. Logan ate the bread and drank the ale and watched them back, and nobody said very much. He was put on the night watch at dusk, which he suspected was the Lord Commander's way of ensuring someone kept an eye on him without having to say so. He didn't object. He walked the top of the wall in the dark, with the wind coming in hard from the north, 300 feet above the ground, and inside a code so clean and comprehensive it had passed beyond discomfort into something closer to clarity. The boy was already up there when he arrived. He was 15. Logan could have told you that within a year, in either direction, without asking, from the specific combination of the voice that had finished breaking, and the face that hadn't finished arriving the way the body had gotten tall before it had gotten settled. Dark curly hair under the watch's black hood, grey eyes, winter pale. He was standing at the northern parapet, looking out at the dark with an expression that was trying to be unreadable and was instead very readable to anyone who had spent 100 years watching young men hold things in. He registered Logan's arrival without startling, which was either good instincts or forced composure. Logan suspected both. They stood in silence for a while. The wind off the darkness to the north had a quality to it that Logan had first noticed in the clearing, something underneath the cold that was not weather. The boy felt it too, he could tell. Whatever it was not the kind of thing you learned to ignore. Where are you from? The boy said finally. Nowhere you've heard of. The boy considered this without dismissing it, which Logan noted. What were you doing north of the wall? Trying to figure out what I walked into. And did you? Not yet, Logan said. Getting there. The boy turned to look at him, then directly. Not the sideways measuring glance that most of the night's watch had given him. The grey eyes were steady and asked things plainly which Logan found he appreciated. There was no performance in it. My name is Jon Snow, the boy said. Logan told him his. They stood with the north wind between them for another long moment. Then Jon Snow, without particular ceremony, said, I'm a bastard. Ned Stark's bastard son, he acknowledged me, which is more than most. The Night's Watch is where bastards come, and criminals, and men who have nowhere else to be. He said it the way someone stated a fact about the weather, not bitterly, not with resignation exactly, but with the flatness of something repeated until it had been worn smooth. "I'm not complaining. I chose this." "I know," Logan said. "Pyre, you're not complaining." John looked at him. "You can tell the difference. People who are complaining want you to say it isn't so. You didn't." Something shifted in the boy's expression. Small, quickly controlled, but Logan had been reading faces for longer than Jon Snow had been alive. What was there was not gratitude exactly. It was the particular quality of a person who had not been listened to recently, recognizing that they had been listened to now. They stood until the watch changed. They didn't speak much more. They didn't need to. The north wind moved through the dark below the wall in a way that suggested it was coming from something that had mass and direction and intent, and they both stood there, and let it be what it was, and that was its own kind of conversation. At dawn, Logan went back down. The Lord Commander was already in the hall, because men like the Lord Commander were always. He looked at Logan with the settled expression of a man who had made his peace with the answer he expected. "South," Logan said. "You'll need provisions." "I'm all right." The Lord Commander nodded again with the same equanimity as the night before. He had clearly decided that Logan was something that existed outside the categories he had available, and he was making the pragmatic choice not to hold up operations while he built new ones. He picked up his cloak. It had been cleaned while he slept, which was the Night's Watch's way of being hospitable without saying so, and walked out through the gate. Behind him, at the top of the wall, the boy with the grey eyes was probably still standing at the northern parapet, looking at the dark. Logan walked south toward Winterfell, where the Night's Watch survivor had said the Lord of the North was in residence, and where the questions he was carrying had the best chance of finding someone with answers. The warmth hit him before the gates did. He had been moving through cold for 2.5 days by the time the walls of Winterfell appeared through the mid-morning grey, and the cold had settled into the category of permanent conditions. Not painful, his body kept him past pain. Something you stopped registering without it ever actually stopping. And then, 50 yards out from the outer wall, the quality of the air changed. A degree. Then several. The castle was breathing warmth into the snow around it, some subterranean source of heat finding its way through the stone and ice in long, slow exhales, and Logan stopped walking for a moment and simply stood in it. He had not been warm since he arrived in this world. He stood there for a few seconds, which was longer than he usually stood anywhere, for no tactical reason. And then he started walking again, because the warmth was not something he was prepared to be sentimental about, but he noticed it. He filed it. The guards at the gate were 2 men in grey cloaks with the specific posture of people who had been told to look formidable and had been managing it for long enough that they'd stopped thinking about it. They stopped him with crossed halberds and a question about his business. "My name is Logan," he said. "I've come from the wall. I have news for the Lord of Winterfell." They looked at him, at the cloak that had seen better days, at the hands, at the face which gave them nothing particularly useful. He had been told before that he had a face that was difficult to read, and it was true. It was not that he hid what he felt, but that what he felt tended to register as a mild, comprehensive watchfulness that people mistook for stoniness. The guards were working out whether he was a threat or a vagrant, which was a reasonable thing to be working out. The question was settled for them before they had resolved it, because the girl arrived. She came from the direction of the inner yard, moving at a speed that suggested she had been told to slow down and had forgotten, small and dark-haired and wearing a face that was already 3 steps ahead of whatever she was going to say. She was 11, perhaps, or close to it, and she had the physical economy of someone who had been climbing things and running since she could walk. She stopped in front of Logan and looked at him with dark eyes that assessed rather than assumed, and the guards' crossed halberds between them did not seem to register as a significant obstacle in her calculation. "You're the man from the wall," she said. It was not a question. "Word travels fast," Logan said. "Renly," she caught herself, adjusted. "The man who came back talked. Everyone's been talking." She examined him with the frank concentration of someone doing an inventory. Her gaze landed on his hands. "What is that on your knuckles?" He could have deflected. He usually did, with strangers, with people who hadn't earned the answer. He wasn't sure why he didn't, except that she had asked it like a scholar asking about evidence rather than a child asking about a trick. And there was something in that quality of attention that he recognized and respected. He extended one claw, let it catch the morning light, retracted it. She did not flinch, or step back, or make any of the sounds people made when they saw it for the first time. She watched it go out and come back, and then looked up at him with her chin set in an expression that he was already learning to read as her particular brand of determination. "I want to learn that," she said. "It's not a trick. It's what I am. Then I want to learn how to do what you do. What I do isn't learnable. Everything is a trick if you know how," she said. "Even things that aren't tricks." She considered him for another moment, apparently filing something away of her own. Then, "I'm Arya Stark. My father is the Lord here. They'll let you in." She looked at the guards with the confident impatience of someone who had already passed this gate too many times to regard it as a real barrier. The guards, exercising the institutional wisdom of men who had been told not to upset the Lord's daughter more times than they'd been told anything else, uncrossed the halberds. Logan walked through. Above the inner yard, at a high window in the east tower, Bran Stark had been watching the gate for 20 minutes. He was 10 years old, and he had climbed to that window on the outside of the wall because the inside stairs were too slow and involved passing the kitchen where he'd been told twice that morning to stop being underfoot. He was comfortable where he was, balanced on the ledge with his hands on the stone above him, and he had a good sight line down to the gate and across the yard, which was why he used it. He had seen Arya go. He watched her talk to the man at the gate. He watched the man extend something from his hand, one brief silver moment, and retract it. He was too far up to see what it was precisely, but he had the impression of something blade-like, and he had also the impression that the man's hand was where the blade came from, which was a thing he was going to have to think about. But what held his attention was not the hands. It was the way the man stood. He was not large, particularly shorter than most of the household guards, stockier, built close to the ground the way some men were built who had spent their whole lives working the earth or the sea. He would not have looked formidable standing still if you weren't paying attention in exactly the right way. But Bran was paying attention, because he paid attention to things that didn't make sense, and this man's stillness didn't make sense. People shifted their weight. They glanced around. They had small involuntary movements that bodies made when they were waiting, a hand scratching an arm, a foot resettling. This man had none of that. He stood at the gate and spoke to Arya and looked out at the yard, and he was entirely motionless in between words, with the comprehensive, patient stillness of something that was not waiting because it was always already ready. It was the way the dire wolf pups stood sometimes when the wind changed from the north. Grey wind had done it just last week, frozen in the middle of the yard with every muscle at that specific tension that was not alarm yet, but was the ground floor of alarm. all his attention routed towards something the human members of the household couldn't identify. Nobody moved when Grey Wind did that. It felt like the wrong thing to do. This man had that quality. Bran watched him walk into the yard with Arya beside him, and he thought, whatever you are, you already know about the thing the wolf can smell. And then he climbed back inside the window and went to find his father. The great hall smelled of wood smoke and dogs, and the particular well-worn stone smell of a building that had been lived in for a very long time by people who intended to keep living in it. Logan sat across a table from the Lord of Winterfell and said what he had seen, and said it flatly, because the Lord of Winterfell had the quality that Logan had been hoping for from the moment the man at the wall had pointed south. He listened as though information was valuable. Ned Stark, age 35, the warmth and weight of the name still settling in Logan's awareness, was grey-eyed and serious-faced, with dark hair going to grey at the temples and the particular build of a man who had done physical work his whole life. He asked no questions while Logan was speaking, which was the mark of a man who was actually listening rather than waiting for the pause. When Logan finished, the silence lasted several seconds, while Ned looked at the table with the expression of a man arranging things into the shape they actually were, rather than the shape he'd been expecting. Then, in the clearing, 11. But they weren't all there were. I could feel the mass of them to the north. What direction did they come from? North by northwest, moving in a line, not a swarm. Ned nodded. He did not say, "Are you sure?" or "That is impossible," or any of the formulations that would have told Logan he was talking to someone whose investment in not believing was stronger than their interest in knowing. He said, "I'll send a raven to Castle Black tonight." He looked up. "You'll stay until the matter is clearer. There's a room in the South Tower." "I'm not staying long," Logan said. "A few days." "Then a few days," Ned said without pressing. He had the quality of a man who understood that some things couldn't be kept by asking for them to stay. Logan stayed the afternoon. At dusk, he found his way to the training yard, where the sound of wood on wood and the smell of exertion had reached him through 2 closed doors. Several of the household's younger men were drilling with practice blades, working in pairs, the rhythms of it recognizable across any language or century. He stood at the edge and watched with the professional interest of someone who had seen a great many people fight and could read a fighter's fundamental quality within the first 3 exchanges. The auburn-haired boy at the near end of the yard was good. Not exceptional yet. He was 15 and still carrying the particular inefficiency of someone who had learned technique before they had the body to make technique unconscious. But the bones of it were there, the balance and the decision-making, and in another few years he would be very good indeed. He finished his drill, dismissed his partner, and turned to find Logan watching him with the directness of someone who had already noticed he was there. He introduced himself without hesitation. Robb Stark Logan. Robb looked at him with the frank, slightly cautious evaluation of a young man who had been told his whole life that he was important, and had spent that time trying to figure out if it was actually true or just something people said. "Would you want to spar?" he asked. "The guards say you came from beyond the wall." "I did, and you fought." "Yes." "Then you must be capable." It was not quite a challenge, and not quite an invitation, but the space between them had the quality of both. "I'm capable," Logan said. "That's why there's no point." Robb blinked. "I don't follow. You want to know how you'd measure up?" "I already know there's no useful information in it for either of us." Robb was quiet for a moment, turning this over. He had a face that worked through things visibly which Logan found he liked, not because it made the boy easy to read, but because it suggested that what came out the other side was something Robb Stark had actually thought about. "You're not curious." Robb said. "About whether you can hold your own against someone trained here." "I know I can," Logan said simply. "That's why there's no point." He left the training yard before Robb had finished deciding how he felt about that. He suspected the boy would still be working on it by morning, and that was all right. The best questions were the ones that took longer than a day. He ate supper in the great hall at the far end of the table, with the noise of the Stark household moving around him, children and dogs, and the particular warm domestic chaos of a family that was not performing for anyone, just existing. And he sat in it the way he had sat in the walls cold, fully present, not entirely sure what to do with it, unwilling to look away. The king's party arrived on a morning when the sky had gone from grey to the flat white of old bone, and the sound of them preceded them into Winterfell by a quarter hour, the clatter and percussion of 100 people in motion, horses and wheels, and the shouts of men managing both, carrying through the cold air with the specific clarity of noise in winter. Logan heard it from the training yard, where he had been watching the household men drill with a mild professional interest, and he walked to the outer wall and climbed to the battlements and watched them come. He had been expecting something like a procession. What he got was something more complicated, a city in motion, organized according to hierarchies he couldn't yet read, the banners unfamiliar, but the structural logic of it legible enough. Power moved in the center with cushioning layers around it, and the outermost layer moved with the wariness of soldiers who were performing security rather than feeling it, which told him whoever was in the center was considered safe. The pennants were yellow and black, and the trumpets that preceded them were silver, and none of that meant anything to him yet. The king he identified by the way space organized itself around him. Large and black-bearded and loud in the way that men were loud when the world had told them for long enough that their loudness was welcome. The smell of him reached Logan before the man himself was visible in the courtyard below. Wine, old sweat, and beneath both, an almost rancid quality of something that had once been very impressive and had been sitting in a warm room getting soft for a decade. Not a bad man necessarily, but a man who had stopped fighting anything some years ago, and whose body was keeping the account of that choice. The woman behind him was something else entirely. Logan found her by the rose water first, sweet and formal in the cold air, and then the second scent underneath it that the rose water was doing the work of covering. Something colder and more deliberate. She was golden-haired and green-eyed, and her beauty was the kind that had always known itself and made that knowledge part of its structure, used it the way a good architect used a weight-bearing wall. She sat her horse with the composure of someone who had never in her life been uncertain that she was the most important person in a room. She watched Winterfell's courtyard the way Logan had watched the clearing north of the wall cataloguing, looking for the variable. The man who dismounted beside her moved the way soldiers moved, when they were also something more than soldiers, with an efficiency of motion that came from so many thousands of hours of training that the body had internalized it entirely and stopped being aware of it. Golden-haired like the woman, tall, built with the lean density of someone who had spent their whole life using their body as a weapon. He was the best fighter Logan had seen since arriving in this world, which Logan assessed in approximately 3 seconds and did not subsequently revise. The man hadn't even drawn anything. He was just walking across a courtyard, and Logan could see it in the quality of his footfall, his balance, the way his hands swung at his sides. Someone who had killed many people and not regretted a single one. Behind both of them came a boy of 12 on a pale horse, golden-haired in the same way his mother was golden-haired, and with an expression that was attempting to convey regal detachment and conveying instead what lived beneath it, the look of a child who had never been told no. He was crown prince, Logan gathered from the way the household arranged itself around him. The future of the kingdom, presumably. Logan watched him and thought about the specific economy of a face that reached for authority before it had earned any, and he filed the boy under things to watch, which was where he put everything, until it proved otherwise. The boy felt Logan watching from the battlements. He looked up. They held eye contact for a count of 3 or 4, and then the crown prince looked away, with the deliberate quality of someone exercising the prerogative to decide when a stare was over. He had practiced that. He was 12. That was going to be a problem. Logan had seen that expression before on a different century's worth of men, and it always ended the same way, unless something stopped it early. He didn't know enough yet about how this world worked to know what stopping it looked like. He went down from the wall. The feast that evening was warm and loud and lit by 100 candles, and Winterfell's great hall had a different quality with 100 people in it than it had had with the Stark household alone. Larger and somehow smaller at the same time, the familiar domestic warmth replaced by something. Everyone was watching everyone, which Logan found both interesting and exhausting in equal measure. He sat at the far end of a long table with a cup of something dark and a plate of food he ate without tasting, and watched the room. He watched the king tell a story that made the men near him laugh. He watched Ned Stark, age 35, listen to the story with the specific quality of a man who was being polite rather than entertained. He watched the Stark children, Robb, straight and careful, Sansa, age 13, radiant and nervy, Arya, age 11, looking at everything with the same assessing intelligence she'd turned on his claws the morning before, navigate the different texture of their home with the particular alertness of people who knew their house was temporarily not their own. He watched the golden-haired woman talk to the woman beside her without looking at her, the way people did when the conversation was decorative rather than real. He watched the man from the courtyard, the fighter, the kingslayer, the knight in the white cloak, move through the hall with that same economical ease of someone to whom every room was a battlefield he was choosing not to treat as one. And then at some point after the third course, the man passed behind the golden-haired woman's chair, and their hands met for just a moment on the carved back of it. It was the kind of touch that did not happen between a brother and a sister. Logan's enhanced senses caught all of it, the way her pulse elevated in the 2 seconds before contact and did not come back down for another 5 after, the way his scent shifted with the nearness of her, the specific chemistry of it, something intimate at a cellular level that was not performance and was not casual and was not in any sense that Logan could make of it, the ordinary warmth of family. He sat with his cup and did not look at them, and filed it with the precision of someone who had learned that the most valuable information was always the information people didn't know they were giving. He did not know what it meant yet in this world's terms. He knew what it meant in every world's terms. He knew it was the kind of secret that made people dangerous. He went to bed when the feast was still running, because there was nothing more to learn that night that required him to be conscious, and he was conserving. He woke at first light to the sound of stone. He was on his feet and moving before he had finished being awake, because the sound was wrong. Not the ordinary sounds of a castle waking, not footsteps or voices or the morning percussion of the kitchens, but the specific high-pitched scrape of a shoe against stone. He had heard that sound twice before, in long bad years, and both times something had come after it that did not have a good ending. He ran. He ran faster than anyone in Winterfell had yet seen him run, faster than the handful of early rising guards who had been moving in the same direction registered as possible, and he did not reach the base of the East Tower, Bran Stark hit the courtyard. Logan arrived at the boy's side before the first person to shout had finished shouting, and he did the only useful thing available to him in that moment, which was to put both hands on the stone next to the child's head and make himself a barrier between Bran and the instinct of the people already running toward them to lift him, to help him, to move him, which was the thing that would kill him. "Don't touch him," he said, and then louder, for the people still moving. "Nobody move him." He put his face near the boy's. Bran was breathing, short and shallow and wrong, but breathing, and his eyes were open in the unfocused way of someone who has not yet fully processed what has happened to their body. Logan could smell it, the specific wrongness beneath the blood and the shock, the deep internal disruption at the axis of the child's back. He had smelled it on battlefields, and he had smelled it in the backs of trucks, and he knew exactly what it was and what it meant, and there was nothing at all, that his claws or his healing factor or his century and a half of surviving things could do about it. Ned Stark came across the yard at a run. He came the way a man ran when his child was on the ground, with the specific, terrible controlled speed of someone who was keeping fear from outrunning them by a very thin margin. Logan looked up at him. "Don't move him," he said. "His back is broken. Moving him will kill him." Ned stopped. He looked at his son on the flagstones, and he looked at Logan, and he did the thing that Logan had already learned was characteristic of this man. He heard what was said, believed it, and acted on it in the same instant. He dropped to one knee on the other side of his son and put his hand near the boy's face without touching him, and said, very quietly, "Bran, I'm here." They waited for the maester together. That evening, Logan walked the corridor near the guest chambers because he could not sleep. The healing factor meant he did not need sleep so much as he needed it to have passed, and tonight it would not pass, and the corridor was empty except for the man he had been half expecting to see. The Kingslayer was walking toward him. He did not slow. Logan did not slow. The space between them closed, and they passed each other the way people did in corridors, when neither intended to stop, and just as the distance began to open again, Logan said it quietly to the stone wall ahead of him. The Kingslayer did not stop walking. He did not look back. He said nothing. But Logan was 3 feet behind him when the words landed, close enough to hear it, the single small variation in the man's heartbeat, there and gone, controlled back to baseline in under a second, with the skill of someone who had been controlling things for a very long time. But it had changed. Logan walked back to his room. He lay down on the bed. He thought about what the information was worth and what it would cost, whoever held it, and whether this world had a form for what he was holding that would do Bran Stark any good. He did not come up with an answer before morning. Some problems didn't have answers that could be found before morning. That was something he had learned more times than he'd wanted to. They left Winterfell on a morning that tasted like iron, the sky low, and the wind from the north carrying things Logan had learned to pay attention to. Ned Stark, age 35, had accepted the handship Logan, had heard it confirmed, not from Ned himself, but from the particular quality of how the household moved afterward, the way people rearranged their weight around a decision that had already been made and now required logistics. There was a specific domestic gravity to preparation for departure that Logan recognized across any world, the suppressed grief of people who loved a place and were leaving it. Robb Stark, age 15, stood in the yard as the party formed and watched them go with his father's face. Not the same face he was, auburn-haired and broad-shouldered and had his mother's jaw, but the same quality behind the eyes, the absolute determination not to let the internal show in the external. He was 15 and learning to be a lord before he'd finished learning to be a man, and the party leaving the gates was most of his world, and he stood there and watched it go. Logan had not said farewell to him. He had nodded, crossing the yard with his saddlebag, and Robb had nodded back, and that had seemed correct. Jon Snow, age 15, had gone north a day earlier, back toward the wall, back toward the cold and the watch rotations and the dark. He had said goodbye to his family quietly and without ceremony, because Jon Snow understood that ceremony was a kind of performance, and he was not a performer. Logan had been in the yard when he left. Their exchange had been 3 words. Jon had said, "Come back north," and Logan had said, "I will," and both of them had meant it. He traveled south with the Stark party because King's Landing was where the power was, and the power was what he couldn't yet read, and he couldn't afford to not be able to read it. He was not a sworn man, he was not a guard. He rode at the edge of the column, with the peripheral quality of a man who had decided not to explain himself to anyone who might misread the answer. And the column accommodated this without comment, because the column had collectively decided over several weeks that Logan was the kind of person you gave room to. Sansa Stark, age 13, was inside the royal wheelhouse for most of the first 3 days, but on the 4th day the road had improved, and the autumn light was stronger, and she rode out with her horse alongside the wheelhouse for the afternoon. She had her mother's auburn hair and her mother's blue eyes, and she sat her horse with the careful excellence of someone who had been trained to do everything correctly and had taken that training seriously. She was speaking to her maid about Joffrey. Logan was close enough to hear. He had not sought the proximity. The column had narrowed at a river crossing, and his position had left him 30 feet from her horse for the better part of an hour. What he heard was not gossip or complaint, but something more disquieting, genuine admiration. She described the Crown Prince with the particular warmth of someone who had built an idea of a person and was offering the idea, not. The prince was brave. The prince was kind to her specifically. The prince had paid her a compliment about her needlework and had meant it. Logan listened to her voice shape the word brave around a 12-year-old boy who had backed down from a stranger on a castle wall because the stranger's tone had changed, and he did not say anything. He thought about what it meant to be 13 and entirely serious about an idea. He had met 30-year-olds who were entirely serious about wrong ideas, and correcting them had never once worked by direct contradiction. He stayed quiet and let the river crossing pass and put another 10 yards of column between himself and the wheelhouse. On the 6th day, he found Arya. She was in a clearing 100 yards off the King's Road, not hiding or not trying to, which was why the sound of her footwork reached him through the trees before he had consciously decided to turn toward it. She was working through sword forms with a stick, a proper wooden training sword, he noted. Someone had given her a real one, or she had acquired it by methods he could imagine, with the focused and slightly furious intensity of a person working out a problem through movement. She was good for 11. Better than good, she had instincts for the geometry of it, the relationship between balance and cut that most people spent years acquiring and some never did. He had not said anything. He had come to the edge of the tree line and stayed there, watching, because interrupting Arya Stark when she was working something out was demonstrably a bad idea. What interrupted her was Joffrey. He came into the clearing from the far end with 2 of the household guard and his personal bodyguard, the large man with the burned face, the one who stood at Joffrey's shoulder with the economical stillness of someone whose job required him to be in 2 places simultaneously, and had learned the art of suggesting both. Sandor Clegane, aged 27 to 28, said nothing. He watched everything. Joffrey said, "What are you doing?" Arya stopped her form and turned to look at him with the particular quality she had when looking at things she was deciding whether to bother respecting. She said she was practicing. Joffrey drew his sword. It was gilded, decorative, and also a real sword, and Logan noted both things simultaneously and said that he wanted to see what she was practicing. The tone was not quite a question and not quite a command, and had the specific quality of both that came from a child who had never learned to make the distinction cleanly. He was 12. He held the sword with casual authority and a very slight contempt for the person he was looking at. What followed took perhaps 90 seconds. Logan stepped out of the trees. He did not move quickly. He came out of the tree line at walking pace, with his arms at his sides, and stopped 15 feet from the edge of the clearing, and stood there, just stood there. Joffrey did not notice him immediately. He was focused on Arya, and then one of the guards did and said something in a low voice, and Joffrey turned. Logan looked at him and said nothing. Joffrey's eyes found him, assessed him. This was a thing that Joffrey did. Logan had noticed at Winterfell, this fast hierarchy calculation that boys who had been raised entirely inside power structures performed automatically, and Logan could see the moment the calculation reached its conclusion, and the conclusion was not a threat, not formally dangerous. A man he could dismiss. The guard to Joffrey's left raised his spear. He moved it forward at Logan's shoulder, not a full thrust, more a punctuation mark, a way of saying that the space Logan was occupying was decided upon space. The spear point came off Logan's shoulder, and the guard registered in the subsequent second that Logan had not moved, had not winced, had not looked at the spear. He had looked only at Joffrey. The guard did not move the spear again. Logan said, "Put the sword away." Joffrey stared at him. "Put the sword away," Logan said again. His voice had not changed in volume or inflection between the first saying and the second, which was a quality of voice that Joffrey had apparently not encountered before, because a very brief and very particular thing happened in his face. The hierarchy calculation ran again, found a different answer, and for 1 second could not reconcile it. He was the crown prince of Westeros. He was not told things twice by men standing at the edges of clearings. He sheathed the sword. He did it with the specific precision of someone who was choosing, very deliberately, to interpret this as his own decision. He said something to Sandor Clegane in a low voice that Logan was close enough to hear perfectly and far enough to understand perfectly. A recounting already, a revision of what had just happened, in which the outcome became something the Crown Prince had decided. Sandor Clegane said nothing. He looked at Logan for one long moment with the flat, comprehensive assessment of a man whose professional life consisted of knowing when to move, and then he turned and followed Joffrey back through the far end of the clearing without expression. Logan watched them go. Arya was looking at him. He found her that evening, or she found him. These were functionally the same thing. He had decided early on, since Arya always appeared to be wherever she had chosen to be while maintaining the impression of coincidence. She was sitting on a wagon wheel near the camp's eastern edge, eating bread, and when he stopped near her, she did not look up immediately. "You made an enemy today," she said. "Already had one." "You already had several," she corrected, with the precision of someone who had been counting. "The Crown Prince is a different kind." She glanced up then, with the dark eyes that didn't ask, they just looked. "He's not the kind of enemy you can survive." Logan considered her. He said, "You're assuming I'm the one who needs to survive." She looked at him for a moment, working through this the way she worked through the geometry of sword forms, with honest attention, not performance. Then she went back to her bread. She had the quality of someone who could receive information and integrate it without needing to respond to it immediately, which was a quality Logan respected in adults and found remarkable in an 11-year-old. He went to check on the horses. The stars were out by then, and the road south was quiet. Sansa Stark came to find him an hour after that. She came with the composure of someone who had prepared what she intended to say, which meant she had been rehearsing, which meant whatever she was about to say was harder than it looked. She stood near the edge of the firelight and said, with careful courtesy, that she understood there had been an incident in the wood that afternoon, that the prince had mentioned it. She used the word incident with the delicacy of someone who had learned very young that the word for a thing mattered enormously. Joffrey had told her Logan was insolent, she said, and that he intended to address it when they arrived at King's Landing. Logan looked at her. She was standing very still, the way she stood when she was managing something, the auburn hair and the blue eyes and the careful posture she had been trained into, and beneath all of it something that was trying to work something out. He did not tell her what he had seen in the clearing. He asked her one question instead. Has he ever spoken to you the same way he spoke to your sister this afternoon? Sansa was quiet. That's the only thing I want to know, Logan said. You don't have to answer. She didn't answer. She said good night, very correctly, and went back to the wheelhouse. Logan watched the fire for a while. The road south was long, and he was not looking forward to where it ended, but it ended where it ended, and the people on it were who they were, and he was going to need to understand this world's machinery before the machinery decided for him what happened next. He had been in places where the machinery ran on cruelty before. You could not stop it from outside. You had to know where the gears were. He slept badly, which was unusual. The healing factor kept him from any physical reason to be restless. The restlessness was something else. South, then. And after that, whatever came after south. King's Landing hit him before he could see it. He had been riding with the column for 2 days south of the last way station when the smell arrived. Wood smoke and fish oil, and the specific sweetness of accumulated human waste on a scale he had never encountered in the north. He had lived in cities before, in other lifetimes, other centuries, but nothing that smelled like this. Nothing that smelled like this. Many people occupying this much space with this kind of density. The air carrying layers of every fire that had been lit that morning, every horse that had passed through, every kitchen, every gutter. He pulled his scarf over his nose and processed it the way he processed any overwhelming input, by sorting it into components and filing each one separately until the total was no longer total. He focused on the Red Keep. It rose above the rest of the city on its hill the way things rose when they had been built to do exactly that. Not for usefulness, though it was functional, but to be seen first and understood second, the statement of it preceding any reading of what it actually contained, which was power, and the management of power, and the specifically concentrated anxiety of thousands of people living inside a system whose rules they had not written and could not revoke. He had read cities before. He knew what a city looked like when it was operating under pressure from its own center. He gave Arya the horse because she was 11 and had been in the column for 2 weeks and was done with it. And he walked the lower ward of the Red Keep on foot for the better part of an afternoon, because walking let him think. He did not think about the things people in this city were worried about. He thought about what was moving north of the wall in the dark, and what he would need to learn in this city in order to do anything useful about it when he went back. The city watched him. He was aware of that. He had been aware of it since they came through the gates, the quality of attention that collected in the corners of rooms and at the edges of roads. The watching that did not have a face because the people doing it did not want faces. Ravens, he'd been told, flew faster than road parties. Whatever had been sent north about him had been sent well in advance of his arrival, and whatever had been sent was being read by people who filed information in categories he didn't yet understand. That afternoon, he walked the lower ward with Arya, age 11, beside him. She had dropped the horse at the stables herself and reappeared at his shoulder with the particular quality she had of not having been seen arriving. She walked with the alert economy of someone cataloguing everything and spending no energy on the appearance of not cataloguing. He didn't say much. She didn't need him to. They walked. Above them, at a window set high into the curtain wall of the inner sanctum, something moved in the peripheral quality that his senses tracked without his choosing. A shift in light at a window, the specific stillness of someone standing back from the glass. He did not look up. He noted it. The woman at the window was golden-haired and utterly motionless, and had been watching him since he entered the lower ward. He could not see the color of her eyes from here. He already knew the color of her eyes. He had known it since Winterfell, since the feast, since the moment she had touched the back of Aemma Lannister's hand on a carved chair. Green. The specific shade of green that looked warm from the front and was not. She watched him until he turned the corner at the far end of the ward. She did not come down. The first 3 days were like that. The city's machinery, observing him, filing him, testing the air around him, and not yet deciding what to do about the readings. He was not afraid of this. He was patient with information cycles in ways that most people were not, which was one of the few genuine advantages of having survived the number of decades he had survived. He ate in the garrison kitchen and slept in the room Ned Stark, age 35, had arranged for him, and walked the castle and let himself be watched, because the thing about being watched was that the watchers also had to be somewhere. The men from the small council found him on the 3rd evening. He was in a corridor near the small council chambers. He had been looking for the library, which was to the east, and had taken a wrong turn somewhere that he suspected in retrospect had been arranged. The man who appeared at the far end of the corridor moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had navigated this particular physical space so many times that it had become an extension of their own territory. He was of middle height, brown-haired, and had the kind of face that was considerably more intelligent than it chose to appear, which was a conscious choice, which told Logan something about how the man operated. He introduced himself as the Master of Coin. He was 30 years old, born 268 AC, and he had the quality of a man who had risen from considerably less than this by treating every person he encountered as a resource that could be assigned a value and managed accordingly. His pitch was smooth and had been refined through enough iterations that it no longer sounded like a pitch. He described a business arrangement. Logan would provide a service protection, the occasional application of physical persuasion to a situation that required it. Petter Baelish would provide information and access. Both parties would benefit. The offer was wrapped in gold and delivered with the confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been refused by someone who could not afford to refuse him. Logan let him finish. "I don't use gold," Logan said. Baelish's eyes remained entirely pleasant. "What do you use?" "Exits," Logan said. He stepped around Petter Baelish and walked toward the far end of the corridor. He did not hear footsteps following him. He heard something else, the specific quality of a silence that was being managed by someone deciding how to reclassify a variable. He filed that under. This man is now thinking. He will reach a conclusion. The conclusion will not be in Logan's favor, but it will take him a while to act on it, because men like that preferred patience over speed when they thought they had time. He found the library on his second attempt. It was large and poorly organized, and smelled of old leather and tallow, and he spent the better part of an hour walking its stacks, trying to find anything in the section the maester had directed him toward. Histories, texts on the long night. He could read the script. Westeros had a single written language that he had been parsing for weeks. What he found in the histories was fragments, references to creatures of cold and darkness in accounts so old they had become legendary rather than factual. The kind of writing that happened when a generation stopped believing their grandparents. He recognized this process. He had lived through it in other contexts. The thing that kills you gets reclassified as a story for children, and then you are surprised when it comes back. He went back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about what he was doing here. He had come south because the structures of this world were centered here, and he could not fight what he didn't understand. That was still true. But he had been in King's Landing for 3 days, and he understood very little more than he had on arrival, except that there were at least 2 people working information systems that reached throughout the castle, and probably throughout the city, and one of them was the woman at the window. The city's politics ran at a register he did not yet have the language for, not the language of speech, which he had managed well enough, but the language of what the speech was doing, the layer beneath the words where the real negotiations happened and the real threats were formed. Winterfell had had that layer too, but at Winterfell it had been a family layer. Who loved whom and who was afraid for whom, and what the grief of a boy's broken back meant to a man who had been asked to leave his home. He could read family language. He had been reading it for a century and a half. This was different. This was institutional, compressed, entirely concerned with power, at the level of the continent. He had stood in a corridor while a man who controlled a kingdom's money offered to buy him, and he had deflected it cleanly, but he knew the deflection had not solved the problem, it had reclassified him. He was now in the Master of Coins accounting, somewhere under a line that said, "Expensive problem, deferred." He needed someone who could translate this city for him. Someone who had been inside its machinery long enough to know where the gears were and who was running which levers and why the whole apparatus was doing what it was doing. He thought of the wall, of the Lord Commander's steady equanimity in the face of threats that his institution was entirely unequipped to handle. Of Jon Snow, age 15, standing at the northern parapet in the dark, looking at something that was not weather, saying nothing because some things couldn't be said yet. He thought about what the Night's Watch survivor had said when Logan asked him what the others were, the weight of it, the way a word carried its whole history when spoken by someone who knew that history personally. He thought, the things beyond the wall are still moving. This city does not know that. This city is fighting about a throne. He went to the window and looked out at King's Landing below, the lights of 500,000 people doing whatever 500,000 people did in the dark, and behind all of it the Red Keep's towers, and behind the towers the sky, which was very clear tonight and very cold for this far south. Cold in a way that he had been noticing and not remarking on, cold in a way that moved down from the north with a quality that was not merely seasonal. He had to find whoever in this city read the old books and had actually believed what was written in them. He had a feeling it was not going to be someone with a title. He found the tavern by smell, which was how he found most things in King's Landing, and Tyrion Lannister by the quality of the voice coming through the tavern's door. He had been walking the lower city for 3 days, not aimlessly or not entirely. He had a functional map of the Red Keep and the streets immediately below it, and was working outward in a methodical spiral, cataloguing by smell and sound, and the specific information that came from watching how people moved through space when they thought they were not being watched. He had not found the person he was looking for. He had developed a thorough inventory of what he was not finding. He was beginning to think that whoever in this city had read the old books and believed them was not keeping court near the small council chambers. The voice through the tavern door was talking about philosophy, not performing philosophy or deploying it at someone in the way people deployed philosophy when they wanted to demonstrate their possession of it. Talking about it, following the thought, genuinely interested in where it was going. Logan had not heard that specific quality of voice since Jon Snow, age 15, had stood on top of the wall in the dark and said things that he was actually figuring out rather than reciting. He opened the door. The man at the table near the window was a dwarf. He was also, Logan assessed in the first 3 seconds, the first person he had encountered in this city who was not managing a mask. The scent of him carried no controlled performance, no layer beneath the surface behavior that was running a different operation. He smelled exactly like what he appeared to be. Someone who had been drinking for an hour, was thinking hard about something, and was entirely comfortable with both conditions simultaneously. He looked at Logan when Logan came through the door, and his eyes did the thing that very intelligent people's eyes did. They assessed rapidly and then let themselves be openly interested rather than concealing the interest. He was perhaps 28, with pale Lannister coloring, and he had the quality of a man who had been told since childhood that he was not what he should be, and had decided, somewhere along the way, to be interested in that rather than destroyed by it. "You're the one who cannot be killed," Tyrion Lannister said. "I've always wondered what that would feel like." Logan sat down across from him. "Mostly boring," Tyrion laughed. It was a real laugh, not the social percussion of a room that was laughing because laughter was expected, but the specific sound of genuine amusement, the kind that came out because it had to. Logan noted that no one had laughed like that in his presence since he arrived in this world. He noted further that he found it unexpectedly difficult not to want to make it happen again. The tavern was warm and smelled of cheap wine and tallow, and Tyrion filled Logan's cup without being asked and refilled his own and said, "The city has been watching you for a week. I've been hearing reports." He said it with the casual directness of someone who had no particular investment in concealing that he received information. A man who doesn't bleed correctly, who made the crown prince sheathe a sword on a road, who turned down gold from Petter Baelish, which no one in this city has done twice. He paused. "He'll make you regret the once, just so you know." "I know," Logan said. "And yet you don't seem particularly concerned." "I'm concerned about the right things." Tyrion's eyes did the rapid assessment again. He drank. He thought in the specific, visible way of someone whose internal process was quick and didn't bother to hide itself. Then, if you cannot be killed, why are you being careful? Logan looked at him. It was, he thought, the best question anyone had asked him, since Jon Snow's questions on the wall, since a 15-year-old in black had stood in the cold and asked, "What were you doing north of the wall?" with the specific quality of someone who actually wanted to know. He took a moment to answer it correctly. "Because the things I saw beyond the wall can't be killed the way I can be hurt," he said. "And I don't know enough yet about what kills them." Tyrion went quiet. He set down his cup. His face, which had been doing the thing it did when it was engaged, something mobile and interested, not quite controlled, went still in a different way, the way it would go still if the thing it had just heard was being filed into a structure that required rearrangement to accommodate it. He said, "You'd better come and talk to someone who reads." The morning after that, a child appeared at Logan's door. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, with a folded note, and the specific blankness of a child who was doing something she had been told to do, and had not been told what it meant. The note asked him to meet someone who serves the realm in a chamber in the east wing of the Red Keep at the hour after the evening bell. He went because he wanted to know who was asking. The chamber was warm and smelled of rosewater, and beneath it a man who was very clean and very careful about being very clean. The man who rose from the chair near the fire was bald and heavy, and moved with the specific fluid silence of someone who had been navigating rooms like this for long enough that his body had made the physics of it invisible. He had powdered his face, or powdered something. Logan's nose was reliable about these things, and beneath everything there was a man who was working very hard at the absence of tells. He introduced himself by title only. He served the realm, he said. He had been admiring Logan's qualities from a distance, and hoped Logan would not take it as impertinence if he wondered aloud whether those qualities might occasionally serve the realm's interests. The offer was smooth. Logan could tell it had been given before in rooms like this to people with different specific vulnerabilities, and had been adjusted for him in ways that were meant to look like customization. Information and access, in exchange for protection, and the occasional application of specific force to a problem that required it. Logan said he was not available for hire. The man who served the realm was not ruffled. He had, Logan noted, the particular quality of people who planned 3 conversations ahead and therefore could not be surprised by the conversation. "Then I'll simply tell you things for free," he said pleasantly, "and hope you develop gratitude." He told Logan about the previous hand of the king. The man had been recently deceased when Logan arrived. That much was known. It was the event that had sent the king north to Winterfell, that had set everything in motion. What was not widely known, the man who served the realm said, was the manner of the death. The previous hand had been investigating something. He had found something. The finding had preceded the dying by a specific and very short interval. He said it with the smoothness of someone reporting weather, factual, without affect. Logan filed it. He said, "Thank you." He left. The man who served the realm watched him go, and Logan's hearing registered something very specific in the silence. Neither satisfaction nor disappointment, but a kind of patient recalibration. The sound of someone deciding how long to wait before trying a different approach. He did not wait long. Logan had already moved on. Ned Stark, age 35, summoned him the next morning. The summons came not through formal channels, but through Ned himself, who appeared in the corridor outside the rooms he had assigned Logan and knocked, which was a thing very few people in this castle would have done. He asked Logan to walk with him. They walked to the Godswood, a small walled garden within the Red Keep, quiet in the way that places were quiet when people used them for thought rather than for politics, which made it unusual in this castle. Ned said, "You told me in Winterfell that you'd noticed something about the Lannister twins." "I said I noticed something," Logan said. "I didn't say it was my place to put it in words." Ned waited. Logan told him. He described it the way his senses had registered it. Elevated pulse in both of them in the 2 seconds before and after the touch. The specific alignment of their sense, the cellular intimacy of it that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with something else. The kind of touch that did not happen between a brother and a sister. He said it flat and without emphasis, because it was information, and because Ned Stark was the kind of man who received information without needing it performed for him. Ned's face did not change. His heartbeat did. It did the specific thing that Logan had learned to listen for in this world, the small involuntary acceleration that happened before a man could decide what to do with what he'd just heard. It lasted 2 seconds. Then Ned's face did the thing it did, when he had decided which was to settle into a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, less open, more interior. "What are you going to do with it?" Logan asked. "What I should." They walked back separately. Tyrion found Logan that evening in the library. He came through the door with the specific energy of someone who had been inside a room, thinking for several days, and had arrived at conclusions. He sat down across from Logan with 2 volumes under one arm and the black humor of a man reporting news that was interesting and terrible simultaneously. "According to every maester who has written on the subject, there are only 3. The creatures you described cannot be killed by conventional means," he said. He said it without preamble. He was, Logan had decided, the kind of person who preferred not to waste time on preambles. "Only 2 things destroy them: dragon glass, obsidian, and Valyrian steel." Logan said, "What's Valyrian steel?" Tyrion looked at him with the brief expression of a man recalibrating for an audience that had not read the same things he had read. "Something very rare," he said, "and very sharp like you, but classier." He said it completely without malice, and Logan was aware that it was a joke, and found that it landed in the same place as the laugh in the tavern, in whatever part of him registered when someone was treating him like a person rather than an assessment. "Where do I get the obsidian?" Logan said. Tyrion opened the older of the 2 volumes, found a page he had marked. He read aloud a passage in the careful tone of someone who had decided to trust what the text said because the alternative was to assume their own modern certainty was reliable, and it wasn't. The passage mentioned the island fortress of Dragonstone, east of King's Landing, on the mouth of the Blackwater Bay, a former Targaryen stronghold. The texts described dragonglass deposits, volcanic glass, obsidian in quantities, cached within the castle and the island beneath it. "How old is this?" Logan asked. "Very." Tyrion closed the volume. "It's historical speculation. I cannot tell you whether the deposits are still there in any useful quantity. I cannot tell you whether anyone has catalogued them recently. What I can tell you is that Dragonstone is where the sources place the largest quantity of the only substance in the known world that kills the things you are describing." He looked at Logan across the table. "Is that helpful?" Logan looked at the table. He had been reactive since he arrived in this world, reacting to the cold, to the dead, to the wall, to Winterfell, to the road south, to this city. He had been gathering information and filing it. He had not had a goal. A goal was different. A goal was, go to Dragonstone and find out what is there. "Yes," he said, "that's helpful." Tyrion poured more wine. Outside the library window, King's Landing went on doing what it did, performing itself at enormous scale, one layer beneath another, all of it concerning the wrong thing entirely. Logan sat in the warm library across from a dwarf who read old books and had actually believed what was written in them, and he thought, this is what the city had, that the wall didn't. Not power, not resources. He was going to need to come back. The wine arrived in the late afternoon with a servant he had never seen before, which should have been enough. He drank it anyway. Not from carelessness, but from a calculation that had served him for a century and a half. If someone wanted to know what he could survive, the cleanest answer was to let them find out. The bottle was good. Better than anything that had come to his room before, with the specific quality of wine that had been kept at the right temperature for a long time by people who understood the difference between drinking and ceremony. He poured a cup and stood at the window and drank it while the light went out over the city below. Within the hour, he was on the floor. He had been poisoned before. He had a working taxonomy of it. Fast acting, slow acting, the ones that started in the gut and the ones that went to the blood directly, the ones designed to stop the heart, and the ones designed to collapse the lungs. This one was sophisticated. It moved through the system with the efficiency of something purpose-built, hitting the major organs in sequence with the methodical patience of a professional. His kidneys first, then his liver, then the specific darkness at the edges of his vision that told him his body had decided to route all its available resources to the healing factor and deprioritize everything else. He lay on his back on the stone floor and looked at the ceiling and found it mostly infuriating. Not frightening, he had stopped being frightened of dying somewhere in his second decade of being unable to. What replaced the fear was something more workmanlike, the specific irritation of a body that had been interrupted in what it was trying to do. He breathed slowly and let the healing factor work, which was not a thing he had to manage actively, but a thing he had to not interfere with, the same way you did not interfere with a fire by pouring water on it because you were cold. He stayed still. He stayed conscious. The organs that the poison was shutting down came back online in sequence, slower than the wounds in the clearing beyond the wall, slower than the spear on the King's Road, because the healing factor triaged by severity, and this was a systemic assault rather than a local one. By morning, he could stand. By midday, the poison had been fully metabolized, and his body was running the mild, elevated efficiency state it ran after serious insult. Everything sharp, a slight warmth in the muscles, the sensation of having been entirely overhauled against his will and come back marginally cleaner. He went to the kitchen and ate a large breakfast. 2 servings of bread, cold meat, half a wheel of cheese that the kitchen staff watched him eat, with the specific expression of people who had received no instructions about this and had decided not to ask. Then he went to find Cersei Lannister. He did not find Cersei Lannister. He found Jaime. Jaime Lannister, age 32, was standing in the corridor outside Cersei's chambers in his white Kingsguard cloak, with both hands at his sides and the specific stance of a man who had positioned himself where he was standing on purpose and had been there long enough that the corridor had become his. He was golden-haired and built with the lean economy that Logan had clocked at the Winterfell gates, someone who had spent their whole life using their body as a precision instrument and had not wasted a single movement of that life on anything that didn't serve the instrument. He was at this moment the most dangerous human being in King's Landing. He was also expecting Logan. That was the first thing Logan registered, the scent of readiness, not surprise. Jaime had known he was coming. He had either known about the wine, or he had known about the morning-after behavior of people who were poisoned and survived. Both spoke to a specific kind of preparedness. They looked at each other across 15 feet of corridor. Jaime said, "You should have accepted the wine as a courtesy and not come back here." "I should have said something," Logan said, "the night the boy went out the window. I didn't. That was the mistake." Something moved in Jaime's face. Not much. He was controlled in the way that men were controlled, when the control had been built very deliberately over a long time and was now structural rather than effortful. But it moved. "What do you want?" Jaime said. "For you to know," Logan said, "that you can't kill me, and that I'm not going anywhere." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere further in the castle, a door closed. The light through the narrow window to Logan's left put the shadow at a long angle across the stone between them. Jaime was quiet for a moment, and in the moment Logan's hearing tracked what it always tracked when a person was deciding something. The breathing, the pulse, the small inventory of a body working through options and filing most of them away. He was not reaching for the sword. Logan had expected him to reach for the sword. He had been prepared for the sword in the abstract way of someone who was not afraid of a sword, but was interested in the geometry of what happened next. He did not reach for it. He said, "Men who cannot be killed are either gods or problems." He paused. His green eyes were still and completely attentive, the eyes of someone in a room who was tracking every variable simultaneously and updating. "Which are you?" Logan said. "Guess." Jaime looked at him for another second. Then he stepped aside, not far, not with any quality of concession or backing down. He stepped aside the way a man stepped aside on a bridge, when he had decided that today was not the day to fight for passage, because the bridge was narrow and the other man was specifically constituted to win a bridge fight, and there was another bridge, and time was available. He stepped aside, and Logan walked past him. Walking away from Jaime Lannister, Logan was aware of the space between his own shoulder blades the way he was rarely aware of it. Not from fear, because the sword was not coming. He could hear that the sword was still sheathed, and the heartbeat was controlled, and the footsteps were not following. That was not over. He had known men like Jaime Lannister before. Not many. Men who were that good and that controlled and that entirely certain of their own capacity. They did not forget. They did not let things go. They waited for the geometry to improve. And in a castle where someone could be poisoned in their room, the geometry could always be made to improve. He thought, somewhere in this city, Bran Stark, age 10, is lying in a chair that he will not leave. And the man who put him in it just let me walk away because drawing a sword in a corridor was inconvenient today. He kept walking. Ned Stark, age 35, received him in the room he used for private meetings, which was smaller and less formal than his public receiving room, and smelled of maps and old wood. He looked at Logan's face when Logan came through the door and said, before Logan had said anything, what happened? Logan told him about the wine. He told it the same way he told everything to Ned, flat, without embellishment. Wine arrived. He drank it. He was on the floor for most of the night. He recovered by midday. He had been looking for Cersei Lannister, and had spoken instead to Jaime. Ned listened to all of it. His face did the thing it did when he was taking in information that confirmed a shape he had already suspected. A slight settling, like a man adjusting his weight when the ground turned out to be exactly as uneven as he had thought it was. He said, "Leave King's Landing. Take the girls somewhere safe, and go to the wall. You've said yourself that is where the real danger is." "I'm not leaving you," Logan said, "in a city where people are putting poison in the wine. I am the hand of the king." Ned said it with genuine frustration, not the frustration of a man who thought he was being underestimated, but the frustration of a man who needed something to be true and was asserting the truth of it by force of will. "I have the city watch. I have the legal authority of the office. I am not without resources." Logan looked at him. He did not say what he was thinking. He had learned this about Ned Stark. There were things that couldn't be told to him, because they would be processed through the framework of what a good man should know about the world. And the framework was wrong for this city, in ways that Ned could not yet see, and Logan had not found the words to show him the frame itself was wrong. He could tell Ned that Cersei had tried to kill him. He had. He could tell Ned what Jaime had said, and what it meant he had. He could not tell Ned the one thing that the information was pointing at in the most specific terms, which was, and yet the boy went out the window. The resources were not the problem. Honor in a place that had no use for honor except as a vector, for getting honorable men to stand still. He said, "All right." He left. He walked the Red Keep that night when the castle was mostly quiet, which was not entirely quiet because a castle this size was never entirely quiet. It breathed. It had a specific rhythm of guards, changing rotations and doors opening on stiff hinges, and the particular sound of a large number of people in proximity, most of them asleep. He had walked it enough nights now that the rhythm was familiar to him, the way a song was familiar when you had heard it enough times to anticipate the next note. Tonight, the rhythm was off, not by much. Nothing he could point at specifically, no conversation he was not supposed to hear, no unusual scent coming from an unusual location. It was more pervasive than that. A pressure change, like the specific drop in air quality that preceded very large weather. He had felt this before, not often, but in places where things were about to happen in ways that could not be undone after. He had learned, over a century and a half, to pay attention to it. He had not always listened in time. He stood at the window at the end of the east corridor and looked out at King's Landing in the dark. The city was running. It ran all the time. This city, its 500,000 people doing whatever they did without knowing or caring what happened in the castle above them. The castle was something that happened to them from a distance. He had been inside it long enough that it felt like a place, a set of corridors and relationships and competing pressures. From here, it felt like what it actually was. A machinery. Something in the machinery was shifting into a different configuration. He didn't know enough about how it worked to name what he was sensing. He knew it was moving fast. He knew from long experience that the gap between sensing the change and being in a position to do anything about the change was where most of the damage happened. He stayed at the window for a long time. Then he went back to his room, which was the room of a man who did not have enough information yet, and sat on the edge of the bed and waited for morning to give him more. It didn't give him what he needed. It rarely did. The raven came before dawn, and by the time the news had traveled through the castle's internal channels and reached the corridors where Logan walked, the castle was already a different place than it had been the night before. The king was dead. Logan heard it in the specific way he heard things in this castle, not from a single source, but from the aggregate of what every source was doing. The raised voices, in the small hours the footsteps that had the particular quality of people moving with decision rather than routine. The smell of anxiety spreading through the corridors, in the way that anxiety always spread, from the people who knew outward to the people who were finding out. He had been awake already. He was usually awake before trouble arrived. He had learned that this was not prescience, but pattern recognition, that the body registered changes in ambient mood before the conscious mind could name them, and his body was better at this than most. By the time the sun was up, the shape of what had happened was clear enough. The king had died in a hunting accident. The crown prince, Joffrey Baratheon, aged 12, born 286 AC, was being prepared to be named king, with a speed that was not the speed of grief, but the speed of a plan that had been waiting for its moment. Ned Stark, age 35, had received the raven and had moved. Logan could map the movement from the secondary effects of it, from the way the hand of the king's household was suddenly in motion, from the specific urgency that radiated from Ned's apartments toward the lower castle and the gates. He was trying to secure something, the throne for the rightful heir, the king's brother at Dragonstone, who was not in King's Landing and could not get here in time if the Lannister household moved first. The Lannister household moved first. Logan was crossing the outer courtyard of the Red Keep when he heard the arrest happen. 200 yards, a stone wall and a colonnade between him and the sound. What reached him over that distance was a crowd going suddenly still, which was a specific silence distinguishable from ordinary silence by the quality of held breath within it, the metallic smell of drawn swords arriving on the light wind, and the raised heartbeats, the aggregate pulse spike of a large number of people in a confined space responding to a threat simultaneously. He moved before he had finished processing the information, which was what he did when he had to, the body deciding before the mind had assembled the full picture. He reached the scene during the arrest itself, not before it. The courtyard between the main hall and the east gate was full of Lannister gold, the specific color of their guards' cloaks, dozens of them, in a formation that had not been improvised. This had been planned for some time. They had waited for the Raven. They had been in position before the Raven arrived. He understood this in the 2 seconds it took him to assess the space, and then he stopped thinking about it and moved toward Ned Stark. He reached 3 soldiers before anyone registered what he was doing. He was not trying to be quiet about it, he was trying to be fast, which was a different thing, and the 3 soldiers dropped with the specific efficiency of men whose sword arms had been opened to the bone, and who were now on the ground trying to manage the situation. He was not killing them, he was removing them from the immediate geometry. He reached 2 more before the formation responded. The formation responded. He had not taken this seriously enough. He had been thinking of soldiers as individuals to be removed, and they were that, but they were also a thing he had not fought before in this world. Men who had trained together, who knew how to work collectively against a single target. They were moving toward him rather than away from him, which told him this had been anticipated too, that someone had thought through the problem of Logan and had arrived at a solution before the situation began. He put his claws through 2 more cloaks, and then they were on him. Not with swords, with chains and weight, and the specific tactics of a coordinated pin that did not depend on wounding. They came from 3 sides, and they were fast and they were many, and he put 2 of them on the ground, and then there were more of them, and more after that, and the chains went around his arms not once, but many times in quick succession, and the weight of men pressed down. He could tear a man apart. He could not tear a chain apart, while 20 men were actively preventing his arms from achieving the geometry required to do it. This was not a wound. This was a physics problem, and the physics problem had been thought through by someone who understood the distinction. He heard Ned Stark's voice very clearly from across the courtyard, controlled, telling someone something in a tone that was still giving instructions rather than asking for help. Then a thud, then nothing. Logan did not stop trying to free his arms. He kept the attempt going even as more weight pressed down, because the attempt was still correct, even when the outcome was not. But he understood, in the specific way he understood irreversible things, that he was not reaching Ned Stark in the next 60 seconds. He was not going to reach him in the next 60 seconds. That window had closed. He stopped thinking about the next 60 seconds and started thinking about the next 24 hours. He freed himself in the night, when the number of men maintaining the pin had been reduced to a rotation of guards rather than a mass of soldiers. He worked on the chain's geometry with patience rather than force, which was not his natural mode, but was the correct mode for this particular problem. He had been learning a version of patience for a century and a half. Eventually, the angles aligned. He did not stay where he was. He moved. He knew where the execution was scheduled. The city knew. This information had been moving through King's Landing with the specific speed of official news. That is also terrible news, the kind that people tell each other because they cannot hold it alone. He had heard it through 3 stone walls from a guard who had told another guard, with the quality of voice of a man who disapproved and was going to follow orders anyway, because that was the situation. He moved through the city at a speed that people in the streets registered as wrong, without being able to articulate why he was not running in the sense of arms and visible effort. He was covering ground in a way that the healing factor enabled, and that looked to the people he passed. like someone moving through a dream at the wrong scale. He ran. He ran through the lower city and through the press of people moving toward the sept and through the streets that narrowed toward the square. And he knew before he arrived, his body was already telling him, in the way his body told him things that he did not want to know, because the crowd had the specific quality of a crowd that had witnessed something and was already beginning to disperse from it. He arrived at the square. It was over. He stood at the edge of the square, and the square was what it was, and Ned Stark was not in it anymore, in any sense that mattered, and Logan stood still for a specific number of seconds that he could not have counted and did not try to, because he was making himself look at what was there rather than looking away from it. Because looking away was how you lied to yourself about what had happened, and he had stopped lying to himself about this category of thing a very long time ago. Then he looked for the girls. The crowd was moving in every direction and was dense enough that smell was difficult and sound was useless, and he was working on sight alone. He saw Sansa, age 13, one moment, perhaps 10 seconds. Her auburn hair and her face, which had the quality of a face that had received an impact so large it had not yet begun processing it, and was functioning on the outside while the inside was somewhere else entirely. She was being moved by Lannister soldiers, who were surrounding her with a specific efficiency of men herding rather than protecting. He started toward her. The soldiers moved between them before he could reach her. The crowd shifted. She was gone. He calculated. Sansa was visible. She was being managed. She was in custody of a kind that was not freedom, but was not, at this moment, a situation of immediate physical danger. She was a hostage. That was the role she would be given, and hostages were kept alive as long as they remained valuable. And a Stark daughter in Lannister custody would remain valuable. She was the worst kind of safe, but she was alive. He looked for Arya. He could not find Arya. He searched for 40 minutes, pushing through the crowd in every direction, casting by smell. He knew her specific scent had been cataloguing it since the Winterfell gate, could find it in a crowded hall. He could not find it here. The crowd was too large, and the movement too chaotic, and too many people had passed through this square too recently, laying scent trails over each other until the specific became general. He could not find her, which meant she had gone. Not captured, gone. She had moved fast, and she had moved smart, and she was not findable, which was exactly the outcome consistent with everything he knew about Arya Stark. He had watched her practice sword forms in a clearing alone at dawn. He had watched her navigate the Winterfell gate at 11 years old, with the ease of someone for whom barriers were information rather than obstacles. She had gone to ground in a city of 500,000 people, and she had done it quickly, and she had done it well. She was not findable because she had made herself unfindable. That was not a catastrophe. That was, under the circumstances, the best available outcome for Arya Stark. He stopped searching. He found a rooftop in the lower city by the oldest method available to him, which was to climb until he was above the noise. And he sat on the edge of it and looked at King's Landing below. The sun was going. The city was doing what it did. 500,000 people managing the gap between what had just happened and what it meant for them personally. Commerce and light and the smell of 10,000 fires and the sound of a city returning to its rhythms the way cities always return to their rhythms, because cities were not people and did not grieve. He was unhurt. That was the part he always came back to in situations like this, not always the rooftop, not always the particular city, but always the part at the end where he was unhurt. 100 years of situations where he was unhurt and the person beside him was not. He had accumulated enough of them to know the shape of the time that came after, First, the specific reality of what had happened becoming real in stages rather than all at once. Then, the long, still period of sitting with the reality once it was real, and then the decision. He didn't weep. He hadn't in a long time. Not from having stopped allowing it, but from having run out of the specific thing that weeping required, which was surprise. He had stopped being surprised by this category of event many decades ago, and he did not know if that was wisdom or damage, and had decided at some point that the distinction was not useful to pursue. He sat with it. Ned Stark had asked the right questions. He had listened when listening was difficult. He had gone to Winterfell's Godswood on a winter morning to hear something he suspected, and had not asked Logan to tell him in a way that was easier than the truth. He was the kind of man that Logan had met, rarely enough across a very long life that he had a category for them that was nearly empty. People who made the world more honest by being in it. He sat with that for the time it required. Then he thought about Robb Stark. Robb, age 15, born 283 AC, was marching south. He had an army. His father was dead, and the news would reach him on the road, and he would not stop marching. He would march harder. He was 15 and capable, and the best version of his father's directness, combined with his mother's willingness to use leverage. He did not need Logan to fight his war. But Logan needed to speak to him before Robb got too deep into a war that was not the one that needed to be won. He would go north. He would find Robb's army on the road, and he would say what needed to be said. He stood up from the rooftop. The city was very loud from up here, and very indifferent to what had happened in the square. The sky above it was the specific pale dark of early evening, and to the north, far north beyond the city and the road and the days of travel and the wall itself, the sky had the quality he had been noticing for weeks, the quality that was not weather. He climbed down from the roof. He had work to do. He smelled the army before he saw it. 10,000 men occupied a particular quality of air that was unlike any other smell he had catalogued in this world, not unpleasant exactly, but dense and specific. Iron and leather and horse and the accumulated smoke of 10,000 separate cook fires burning the same rough mixture of wood and fat, all of it compressed into a moving entity that announced itself from 3 miles out and grew steadily more present as he rode north. He had smelled armies before, in other lifetimes and other wars, and they always smelled the same, like a very large number of people who had decided to do something together, and whose bodies were carrying the chemical record of that decision. He found the vanguard at mid-morning and told them who he was, and they took him back through the column at a pace that said they had been told to expect him, or someone matching his description, which told him that Robb Stark had already been thinking about where Logan was. Robb Stark, age 15, was not the boy from the Winterfell training yard. He was the boy from the training yard, grown into something else by the specific accelerant of having to be, immediately and without transitional time, the thing that his father had been. He was auburn-haired and broad-shouldered, and sat his horse with the uprightness of someone who had decided that how he sat his horse was information he was giving his army, and had decided to give it correctly. He had 10,000 men, and he was managing them with the specific quality of someone who had good instincts and was learning the craft of managing instincts in real time. He was 15, and every year of it was visible, and he was doing it anyway, which Logan found more impressive than any version of the same thing that came naturally. He greeted Logan in front of 3 of his senior men, and his face did something very controlled. "You were there?" Robb said. "You were in King's Landing. How did he die?" Logan told him. He told him in the order that it had happened, and without editing. The raven, the castle shifting overnight, the arrest, the chains, the time gap, the running, the square, the arriving. He told him about the chains and explained why chains had were. He told him about the square in the specific way he had learned to tell people things they needed to hear, about events they could not undo. Without comfort and without additional weight, just the shape of what had happened. He told him the part where he had failed. Robb listened to all of it. He had his father's quality of listening. Logan noted the absolute attention, the absence of the interrupting questions that were really about managing the listener's discomfort rather than gathering information. He did not look away. He did not flinch from the part where Logan had been 200 yards and a stone wall away, or from the part where the chains had been thought through in advance by someone who understood what Logan was. When Logan finished, Robb was quiet for a moment. He did not blame Logan. His eyes had gone to a specific, cold clarity, not the cold of shock, but the cold of a decision being made. And he said, with the flat precision of someone naming the correct target after having confirmed it, the Lannisters. Not a question, not an expression of surprise, a categorization. He had inherited his father's directness and his mother's understanding of where to apply force, and the combination was producing, in a 15-year-old with 10,000 men and a dead father and 2 sisters in the city he was riding away from, something that Logan recognized as very dangerous in the hands of a person with good judgment. He was going to be very good at this war. Logan was not sure this was the right war to be very good at. "Ride with me," Robb said. Logan rode with him. For several weeks he functioned at the front of the army, ahead of the vanguard, in the space between the northern forces and whatever the Lannister host was doing. He was extraordinarily effective at this. He could walk into enemy formations and assess them, and walk out again at a speed that made him functionally uncapturable, and the information he brought back was reliable in a way that scouts were not reliable, because scouts could be frightened or deceived. He could smell an ambush. He could hear a flanking column from a mile. He could stay in a position the entire night without sleeping and without his body registering fatigue the way bodies registered fatigue, and in the morning he could run. He was good at this war. He was good at this war, and it was the wrong war. The Lannisters were people who had done terrible things. They had poisoned his wine and chained him in a courtyard, and let a good man be killed for knowing the truth about them. He had a specific and personal inventory of what they had done, and he was not dismissing it. But they were people. People who fought for reasons that were legible. Power, survival, fear, loyalty of the wrong kind. The things beyond the wall were not people, and they were not fighting for legible reasons, and they were massing with a patience and a scale that everything he had seen suggested was not going to wait for the War of the 5 Kings to finish resolving itself before it arrived. He had seen what they were. He had smelled them. He knew the difference between a threat that could be deferred and a threat that was moving on its own schedule, regardless of whether the people in the path of it had finished their current priorities. He was riding with the wrong army toward the wrong enemy. He found Tyrion on a stretch of the King's Road that curved through flat country, where the visibility was good in both directions, and the light was the clear, hard light of late autumn. Tyrion was moving south, with a small escort of 4 men on horses that had been ridden hard, and Logan recognized the specific quality of a man who had very recently been in a situation he was relieved to have survived. Tyrion looked at him from 20 yards out with the expression he usually wore when something confirmed a hypothesis, a compression around the eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was its precursor. "I heard you were with the Northern Army," Tyrion said. End. He had pulled his horse up, and his escort had pulled up behind him, and the two of them spoke in the middle of the road with the ease of people who had already established that their conversations did not need to be qualified by what side either of them was technically on. "Heading south," Logan said. "Eventually. I've been detained." He said it with the equanimity of a man describing weather. "Trial by combat at the Eyrie. A champion fought on my behalf. I survived it, which continues to surprise the people who arranged it." He paused. "I've been doing more reading." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He had written on it in a compact, precise hand, the hand of someone who had been writing since childhood and had stopped wasting space. He held it out. Logan took it. "Dragonstone," Tyrion said. "I found 3 more references that the library at the Red Keep didn't have. Older texts from the Ares collection. The caches at Dragonstone are more extensively documented than I initially reported. If they haven't been disturbed since the Targaryens abandoned the island, there should be significant quantities of dragonglass in the vaults beneath the castle." He paused again, "And before you ask, yes, I verified this against the original sources, and yes, I know those sources are several hundred years old. And yes, that's the best I have. It's enough," Logan said. They looked at each other across the width of the road. Tyrion's face was doing the thing it did when it was saying something with its expression that it was declining to say with words, which was, "I think you know something that I don't know, and I think what you know is very bad." He made then the small gesture of a man who had decided not to press the point, a slight lift of his chin, a particular quality of resignation that was not hopeless, but was realistic. He gathered his reins. "Go north," Tyrion said. "Whatever you're going toward is worse than what you're leaving." He rode south. Logan put the paper in his coat and rode back toward the northern camp. He told Robb that evening. The army was camped for the night in a river bend that the scouts had assessed as defensible, and Robb was in his command tent reviewing maps with 2 of his captains when Logan came in. And Logan waited until the captains had been dismissed, and then he said, Robb looked at him. The controlled anger that had been running beneath the surface of every conversation since Logan had rejoined him was very close to the surface now. He was 15, and his father was dead, and his sisters were prisoners and fugitives, and he had been doing a thing that was nearly impossible with exceptional competence and without complaint, and what Logan was saying was that he was taking something that had made the impossible slightly less impossible. "My father is dead," Robb said. His voice was very even. "My sisters are prisoners and fugitives. My family is destroyed." He paused. "And you're leaving because you have a better war to fight?" "Yes," Logan said, "because yours ends eventually. One of you wins. The other war doesn't end. The other war ends everything." Robb looked at him for a long moment. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes." "That's what everyone says," Logan said, "about the thing that kills them." The silence in the tent had a specific quality. Not the silence of 2 people who had run out of things to say, but the silence of 2 people who had said the true thing and were now in the space after the true thing, where neither of them could pretend the other was wrong. Robb said, "Go." He said it with the specific quality of a word used to end a conversation rather than continue one. He had turned back to his maps before Logan had reached the tent's opening. Logan rode north at first light. He stopped once, at a rise in the King's Road, where the land fell away south, and the visibility was long. He could see the edge of the army's dust from here, the specific haze of 10,000 moving bodies, already smaller than it had been when he left it, already receding into the autumn haze. Robb Stark was in that dust somewhere, managing his impossible task, fighting his war with the focus and the competence and the honor that he had inherited from the right people and had been given no time to develop slowly. He watched the dust for a moment. Then he turned north and did not look back. The sky above the wall was wrong. He had been noticing it for weeks, in the way he noticed things that his conscious mind had not yet assembled into language. A quality in the northern light that was not season and not weather, a specific cast to the grey above the horizon that he had seen exactly once before. The night he had arrived, the clearing, the dead, the smell of rot and deep cold, amplified into a presence. The sky had been that color then. He rode north faster. The road was long and cold, and he had the specific energy of a man moving toward a problem rather than away from one, which was a different kind of energy from anything the army had asked of him, and he found that his body understood the difference. He had been using himself as a tool for someone else's war, and it had been effective, and it had been wrong, and he was now using himself for his own purpose, which was the only purpose he had ever been able to sustain for long periods. He rode. He thought about Jon Snow, age 15, standing on the wall in the dark, looking north at something that was not weather, saying, "I know." He thought about the survivor of the clearing, in the branches of the tree, pointing south and saying, the others with the weight of a word that had been spoken in that tone for a very long time by men who hoped it would never be necessary again. He thought about Ned Stark's voice saying, "What I should." He rode north faster. The sky above the wall was wrong, and it was getting darker, and the dark was moving. The wall was the same. He had known it would be, and he had known that knowing it would not prepare him for it. The specific quality of standing beneath 700 feet of ice and stone and feeling it in the way you felt, things that were too large to be adequately held in a single visual field. The sky above it was the flat, grey-white of old bone. The air was the specific cold of altitude combined with the cold that came from the north, the two kinds distinct to him in the way the two frequencies of sound were distinct. He stood at the base of it for a moment before going in, not from sentiment, but from the specific practice he had of orienting himself fully in a place before he started making demands on it. Castle Black received him the way it had received him the first time, with the watchful practicality of an undermanned institution that had learned to assess every new variable quickly and categorize it before it became a problem. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch was older seeming than when Logan had last seen him, not in years, because the time had not been long enough for that, but in the quality of someone who had been managing sustained dread and was carrying it in the lines around his eyes. He received Logan in the main hall and looked at him across the table with something very close to relief, which from this man was the equivalent of anyone else falling on their knees and weeping. Logan said, "I know what kills them. I don't have any of it, but I know what it is." The Lord Commander said, "Tell me." Logan told him, "Dragon glass and Valyrian steel." He told him about Tyrion's research, about Dragonstone, about the historical sources that Tyrion had compiled, and the specificity of the documented caches. The Lord Commander listened, the way he had listened the first time, with the complete attention of a man who received information about threats seriously, who had decided long ago that his personal discomfort in receiving terrible information was less important than the information. Then he nodded once, with the equanimity Logan had come to recognize as this man's specific version of "I will do what can be done with this." Jon Snow was in the yard. He was different. Logan had expected, different, had known from the road that a year at the wall would change a 15-year-old into something else, but the specific quality of the change was interesting. He was taller by an inch, perhaps less, and the change was not principally physical. It was in the way he occupied space with a settled confidence that was not the performance of confidence, but the real thing, the kind that came from having been tested and having found out that you were what you needed to be. He was 16 now. His dark curly hair was longer, and his grey eyes had the quality of someone who had stopped wondering if they were capable of this and started wondering what came next. He was talking to a young man who was shorter and considerably heavier, brown-haired and soft-faced, and carrying himself with the specific self-consciousness of someone who had been told by a very large number of people that he was in the wrong place. The young man was looking at Logan's approach with the eyes of someone cataloguing a new variable with genuine scholarly interest rather than wariness. Jon looked up. They looked at each other. The yard was quiet around them. "I should have come back sooner," Logan said. Jon said, "You're here now." He said it with the flatness of a statement of fact that was also several other things. Not a rebuke, not an absolution, but the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood that here, now, was what mattered, and had decided a long time ago. Logan had noticed meeting him the first time on the wall that Jon Snow had an unusual capacity for accepting present conditions without denying the previous ones. He had not lost it in a year. He had refined it. The young man beside Jon introduced himself as Samuel Tarly, age 15, born 283 AC, and introduced himself with the earnest completeness of someone who had decided that the best way to manage new situations was to be entirely transparent in them. He was the Castle Black's most thorough reader of old texts and the only man in the Night's Watch who had been doing that reading because he genuinely wanted to understand what was coming rather than out of duty. He asked Logan several questions about the things he had seen beyond the wall, with the specific alert attention of someone cross-referencing answers against internal models. Logan answered him directly. Samuel wrote 2 things down in a small notebook that he produced from somewhere in his coat, and then put it away with the satisfied expression of a man who had confirmed something he'd suspected. That evening they ate together in the garrison hall, and Samuel talked about the old texts and what they said about the long night, and Jon listened with the quality he had always had of listening, as though what was being said, and Logan sat with the first warmth he had felt since he left King's Landing. Not the warmth of fire, though the hall was warm, but the warmth of being in a room where people were thinking clearly about true things. The assault began 6 hours after midnight. He heard it first. The specific silence that preceded the arrival of the dead, which was not the silence of nothing, but the silence of everything normal, being replaced by something that recognized no obligation to be normal. The wind off the north stopped, not reduced, stopped. He was awake already, sitting at the window of his chamber, and he was moving before the first watch rotation reported it. They came over the wall. They came in the way water came over a barrier when there was enough of it. Not by defeating the barrier, but by exceeding it, thousands of dead things scaling ice that was 700 feet of vertical surface, and scaling it the way things scaled surfaces when they had no relationship with the concept of cost. The wall had been built to hold living armies. Living armies understood survival. These things did not understand survival. They understood advance. Logan hit the top of the wall running and threw himself into the mass of them. The first 10 seconds were familiar. The claws opened things that did not close properly, that continued moving in pieces, that did not register the tearing as a meaningful event. He had done this before, in a clearing north of this same wall in the snow, a year ago by this world's reckoning, and his body had the movements filed at a level below thought. Tear, redirect, tear again, keep them from the men behind him. The Night's Watch was forming up to his south, with torches and drawn steel, but the sheer number coming over the parapet made the line precarious. Fire. He had planned this, had talked to the Lord Commander's men about it, had positioned the oil casks himself in the hours before. He grabbed the nearest one, felt the weight of it, swung it in a long arc into the densest cluster of advancing dead, and opened it mid-swing with his right hand. The oil spread in the cold air the way oil spread, in a sheet catching what light there was and refracting it briefly into something almost beautiful before the nearest brazier's heat found it. The fire took. He moved to the next cask and did the same again, building a line of fire across the parapet that the whites could cross but could not cross without burning, and burning was the thing that stopped them. And the thing about fire was that it was not selective, and he had 165 years of practice with it, and no particular concerns about his own combustibility. The Night's Watch men behind him were buying time with steel and torches, and they were doing it well. Jon Snow was in the middle of them with long claw drawn, the Valyrian steel blade catching the firelight in a way that ordinary steel did not catch it. Something in the specific quality of the metal that was different from other metal, denser, more present. He was aware of the cold before he saw the source of it. It was a different cold from the cold of the wall at night. The night cold was weather. This was deliberate, a focused reduction of temperature that moved with the directionality of a person walking through a room, concentrated and purposeful. He turned toward it. The White Walker was at the north parapet. The difference was legible in under a second. The stillness, the commanding quality, the eyes that were the blue of ice in direct sunlight and were fully present in a way that the White's eyes were not, that had something behind them that was not thought in any sense he could map onto human thought, but was not nothing either. It was taller than the White's. It moved differently. Its ice weapon, a spear of something that looked like compressed cold made solid, was in its right hand, and it was not rushing. It was managing. Logan hit it from the left at full speed. It was stronger than the White's. He had known it would be, and it was more than that. It was the strength of something that was also temperature, so that the contact itself cost something, a seeping cold into his hands and forearms where he grabbed at it. His claws opened, cuts in what passed for its flesh, and the cuts smoked and it slowed without the specific quality of something that could be fully stopped. This way he pushed harder. He drove his left claws into its right shoulder and his right into its thigh and bore it down with the full weight of his body and the leverage of a man who had been doing this exact physical work since before anyone in this world had been born. It went down, it struggled, the temperature around them dropped another several degrees. His skin was going numb at the extremities, and his healing factor was routing resources to the contact points with the white cold urgency of a body fighting frostbite from the inside. He held on. Jon, he didn't shout it. He said it at the volume and direction required for Jon Snow to hear it across the parapet in a battle which was loud enough. Now, Jon Snow was there in 4 seconds. Logan had counted on the 4 seconds because he had been watching Jon Snow move for a year, in different circumstances, and he had assessed the 4 seconds as accurate. It was accurate. The boy was fast, faster than his size suggested, with the specific efficiency of movement that had been developed by someone who had been told their whole life that they were not what they should be and had developed excellence in compensation. He came at a run with Longclaw extended. The Valyrian steel went into the White Walker. It was not like cutting, it was like unmade. The White Walker did not bleed. It did not fall in the way that things fell when they had been mortally struck. It came apart, not violently, not explosively, but with the specific efficiency of something that had been a coherent structure and ceased to be one. the cold intelligence behind the ice-blue eyes going out the way a fire went out when the last fuel was consumed. The white, it commanded, dropped. They dropped everywhere, off the parapet, off the wall itself, from the middle of the battle line where they had been pressing the Night's Watch back by weight of numbers, and the dropping had the quality of a single event happening in many places simultaneously, of a network being severed at its source. The silence that followed was not the silence that had preceded the assault. This was the silence of absence. The assault was over. They stood on the top of the wall in the dawn light, Logan and Jon Snow, both of them cold in different ways, and both of them looking north at a landscape that was still full of things that were coming and had only paused. The fire on the parapet was burning down. The Night's Watch below was accounting for itself in the specific, careful way of soldiers who had survived something, and needed to know who else had. "They'll come back," Jon said. "Yeah," Logan said. Jon was quiet for a moment. He was looking north with the same expression he had looked north with when he was 15, and they were standing on this same wall in the dark, except that now the expression had been tested and had held, and he knew what he was looking at with a specificity that a year had given him. He said, "What do we do? Get more dragon glass," Logan said. "Train more people, and stop pretending this isn't the war." Jon said nothing. He already knew that. He had been saying it in various forms to people who would not hear it for a year, and Logan was the first person he had met who had heard it without needing to be argued into it, and Logan had heard it not because he had been taught it, but because he had seen it with his own eyes in the first hour of arriving in this world. Since. He turned and looked at Logan. "You knew when you got here, didn't you?" Jon said. "Not a question. Exactly. A statement offered back for confirmation. Before you even knew what this world was. I knew dead things don't move on their own," Logan said. The rest followed. Below them, Castle Black was alive with the sounds of the morning after. Men moving, voices calling, the systematic work of people putting a damaged thing back in order with the methodical attention of people who understood that order was something you rebuilt, not something you found. The wall stood behind them and in front of them, and north of it the landscape was still and cold and full of the specific quality of things that were waiting without impatience, because impatience required a concept of time, and the things north of the wall did not operate on time the way the living did. Jon Snow looked north. Logan looked north. They stood there in the cold that did not bother him, watching the light come, and neither of them spoke, because the thing they were both looking at did not require speech. It required presence, and they were present, and for now, that was what there was. The long night was coming. They had time, they would use it. The morning after the assault, Castle Black was quiet. Not silent. There was work to do, and the Night's Watch was doing it, with the methodical attention of men who had learned that the hours immediately following violence were the hours in which negligence became its own kind of casualty. But beneath the work, beneath the voices and the movement and the accounting for the dead, there was a quiet that Logan had learned to recognize in the years he had been learning to recognize things. It was the quiet of a place that had just survived something and had not yet begun to process what surviving it meant. He was sitting in the corner of the yard nearest the wall's base, his back against the stone. He did not need sleep in the way that the men around him needed sleep. The healing factor kept the body running on its own economy, but he needed stillness in the aftermath of serious combat in the way that a machine needed to cool. Not because anything was broken, because the work had been very large, and the body understood this even when the mind was trying to move past it. He was not wounded. That was the part of it that he always had to make himself return to. He was not wounded. The cold of the White Walker's contact had been severe, and his hands had been numb through the night's remaining hours. But the healing factor had worked on it the way it worked on everything, from the inside out, steadily and without ceremony. He was not wounded, he was tired. He was tired in the way that had nothing to do with the body. He had been alive for approximately 165 years, by any reckoning that applied to this world, and in that time he had survived a specific number of wars, and the wars accumulated not as memories primarily, but as a specific weight in the chest. A density that grew, not because you lost the capacity to carry it, but because the capacity to carry it was something that had to be maintained like anything else, and maintaining it took time, and sometimes the time did not present itself conveniently. He was tired the way very old men were tired when they had outlived most of the things they understood, and were standing in a world that had replaced those things with new things that he would have to learn. He sat in the corner of the yard and let his body complete its work, and watched Castle Black wake up. The ravens began arriving 3 days later. They came from the south, in the way that news came from the south, not all at once, but in clusters, each one carrying a piece of a picture that assembled itself into something coherent only when you had enough of them in front of you at once. The picture that assembled itself was the War of the Five Kings, at the end of its first full season of operation, consuming men and harvests and houses with the comprehensive appetite of a conflict that had found its own momentum and no longer required the specific intentions of any individual to keep moving. Robb Stark, age 16, had won several battles. Logan read this in the Ravens, and felt something that was not precisely pride and was not precisely grief, but occupied the space between them, the recognition of a person being exactly what he had understood them to be capable of doing it. He had left Robb's army, and he had been right to leave it. The army was not in need of Logan. The army had Robb. Joffrey Baratheon, age 13, born 286 AC, sat the Iron Throne, because the alternative required forces that had not yet assembled themselves into the correct configuration, and because this world's political machinery rewarded speed over legitimacy when speed. Jon Snow, age 16, read the Ravens. He read them at the table in the hall, and said nothing about them publicly, which was the right choice, because what he had to say about them was not something that the Night's Watch needed to hear from him. He had a father who was dead, and 2 sisters in circumstances ranging from captivity to flight, and a half-brother who was winning a war that was the wrong war, and he was holding all of that steady against the knowledge of the war he was actually in, and he was doing it in the same way he did most things, quietly, with the full weight of it, accepted rather than managed, because acceptance and management were different, and he had learned the difference. Logan watched his face when he put the Ravens down. He did not say anything. Jon Snow did not want something said. He wanted someone to have seen him read the Ravens, which was a different thing, and Logan had learned to distinguish between those things in people he paid attention to. The ship's Raven came from a trading vessel that had put in at East Watch by the sea, on the eastern end of the wall, 10 days after the assault. It traveled along the wall's internal communication chain to Castle Black with the specific inefficiency of a system that had been built for reliability rather than speed, and arrived on a cold afternoon when the yard was busy with training rotations and Logan was sitting on the steps of the main hall watching the training with the mild professional interest he brought to watching anyone work. The maester read it aloud in the hall that evening because he did not know what to do with it, and shared confusion was, in his assessment, preferable to private confusion. A ship's captain, trading in the Dothraki Sea, had witnessed and documented the following. A young woman with silver hair, barely more than a girl, had emerged from a funeral pyre in the open plains with 3 creatures that matched no living animal the captain had ever seen. The creatures were small, they flew, they breathed fire. The captain, who was not a superstitious man and said so, had written the account because he was a thorough man, and this was a thorough accounting of what he had seen, and he did not expect to be believed, and he hoped to be believed. The hall was quiet after the reading. Jon Snow said quietly, "If dragons are real again, everything changes." Logan looked at him. "Dragons can kill White Walkers? Dragon fire." Jon's grey eyes were doing the thing they did when he was thinking carefully about something he did not have enough information to resolve. No one knows. The old texts say fire kills the dead. Dragon fire is fire. But no one has tested it. No one alive has seen a dragon. He paused. No one alive has seen them until now. The hall remained quiet for another moment. The maester folded the raven's parchment. Someone near the door started a question and thought better of it. Logan thought about a girl of 14 or 15, silver-haired, somewhere across a sea he had not crossed, standing in the middle of open plains with 3 small animals that breathed fire. He thought about what it took to produce a person who could do that, the specific combination of inheritance and suffering, and the kind of conviction that either destroyed you or made you into something the world did not have a category for yet. He did not know her. He would not know her for some time, if ever. She was far away, and the wall was here. The wall was here, and the things north of it were still there, and the dragon glass was at Dragonstone, and there was work. Samuel Tarly, age 15, asked him about home one afternoon in the library, with the guileless directness of a person who had learned that asking guileless direct questions was the most efficient way to get information, and had not yet fully internalized that not all people responded well to efficiency. "Where did you come from?" Samuel said, "originally." Before this, Logan considered the question. He had been asked versions of it before in this world. Jon Snow had asked it on the wall on the first night, and the answer then had been "nowhere you've heard of," which was true, but not complete. Samuel was asking something more specific, with the curiosity of a scholar who wanted to understand origin rather than just location. "From very far away," Logan said, "a different place entirely, not somewhere I could point to on any map in this library." Samuel absorbed this with the genuine equanimity of someone for whom the universe's possibilities had always seemed quite large. He said, "Will you go back?" Logan sat with the question for a moment. He had not sat with it before, in precisely this form, had not asked himself directly whether going back was possible, because he had understood from early on that the question of possibility was less useful than the question of present situation. But Samuel was asking it, and Samuel deserved a direct answer. "I don't think the door opens from this side," Logan said. Samuel nodded. He had the specific nod of someone for whom the logic of one-directional doors was not unfamiliar. Someone who had spent his life in rooms full of old texts that described things that could not be reversed, who had learned to take irreversibility as a structural feature of existence. He thought for a moment. Then, because he could not help himself, "If you can't go back," Samuel said, "you might as well be useful." Logan looked at him for a long moment. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It came from the same place the laugh in the tavern with Tyrion had come from, the place in him that responded when someone said the true thing in the simple form rather than the complicated one. It was a sound he did not make often and had not made for some time. "Yeah," he said, "that's usually how it goes." He climbed the wall at dusk. The mechanism that raised him to the top was slow and cold, and he rode it standing, watching the northern sky come into view as the platform ascended, the specific quality of the light at the top revealing itself in stages. First, the grey, then the particular darkness north of the wall, that was not the darkness of a sky without stars, but of a sky in which something was moving that did not belong to the sky. He stepped off onto the top of the wall and stood in the cold that did not bother him. Behind him was everything he had found in this world worth protecting. Jon Snow, age 16, in the hall below, reading old texts by firelight, carrying the weight of his family's war steady against the weight of this one. The undermanned men of Castle Black doing the work of holding something that should not be possible to hold. And distantly, further than he could see but not further than he could imagine, Robb, age 16, in the south, with his army and his father's loss and the wrong war that he was winning. Arya, age 12, somewhere in the city or the road or whatever, came after the city, surviving in the specific way that Arya Stark survived things, which was by being unfindable until she chose to be found. Bran, age 11, somewhere in the north in his chair beginning, Logan suspected, from the things he did not know but felt the outline of, to understand what he could see when he closed his eyes. He could not protect all of them. He never could have. That was not the shape of what he was. He was not a shield, and he was not a warden, and he was not a weapon, whatever the people in this world had been trying to make of him since the moment they had understood what he was. He was a person who went toward the real danger. That was the oldest version of himself he had access to, beneath everything that had been added and everything that had been taken. North was where the thing was that would kill all of them. Here was where he was standing. He extended his claws. The 6 adamantium blades came out between his knuckles, with the sound they always made, the sound that was familiar enough to be indistinguishable from his own heartbeat, and caught the grey northern light in the specific way that metal caught light. When it had been part of a body, long enough to carry the warmth of the body, even in the cold. He looked at them for a moment, then he retracted them. He looked north.